Hey, I'm Anthony Romano, and this video is going to answer the question of if it's okay to mix carbs and fats on your carb days when we're talking about cyclical keto or targeted keto or carb backloading or any sort of strategic carb use coming from a keto diet. Okay, like, do you have to lower your fats? Do you have to, when you have the carbs high? There's a lot of questions people have, and I'm going to make more videos on this, but I'm going to answer some of the questions briefly in this video for when it comes to using carbs and fats after having came from a keto diet, or using one as the backdrop to your life, which is what I recommend. So let's get into this video, and if you like it, that will help YouTube to show my content to more people, and that's all you have to do to help me grow my page. Let's get into it. Alrighty, so I do get a lot of questions on this topic. One that I felt was a very good catalyst for this video is one from Emperor Shiv. So, thank you, Your Highness. Basically, this was a comment on my CKD video, the best way to do a cyclical ketogenic diet, which is basically, where you have keto on some days and non-keto on other days, or, in general, you set up your lifestyle so that you use keto a lot of the time and then you bounce in and out, which is a great metabolic health practice. But the question is, after a decently strict 9 months of keto, I had about 150 carbs from bran flakes, potatoes, and some homemade cookies. Not bad sources right off the bat, because none of them are containing fructose, or at least maybe the cookies, if they're homemade, they're not going to have high fructose corn syrup. And you don't want fructose on any sort of, carb inclusion day, because that's going to fill up your liver glycogen and make ketosis re-entrance more difficult and take longer. I had a good amount of fat with my carbs and felt like I stayed in ketosis. And in the morning, I felt absolutely no carb cravings and was actually craving eggs compared to my normal carb backloading day, where I use whey to spike insulin and then have high carb, low fat for the rest of the day, where I could feel that I probably was completely out of ketosis normally and slightly craved carbs around 1 p.m. Do you think keeping high fat will help you stay in ketosis if you are eating a medium glycemic carbs, or will it just create a ton of de novo lipogenesis, which is basically fat storage, and it can come from combining a lot of fat and carb in the same meal or in the same day? Now, I'm going to break this down, but the starting point for this video is that, how I always talk about the quantity side of the coin and the quality side of the coin, right? And if you're making the wrong macro decisions, that's going to create different hormonal reactions, and you're looking at the individual properties of certain foods to cause those reactions. And then the quantity side is simply looking at total calories, etc. Just looking at the total bird's eye view. You have to merge them together, and this video is going to be one that actually helps you merge them together. Because the short answer, to give you one off the bat, is in general, when you are, having a day where you have carbs and fats making up your macros for your body's energy, the easiest way to prevent fat gain is to simply keep it under the threshold of the quantity side of the coin, right? This is where we merge them together, so that even if you're making, not the wrong, but even perhaps not the most optimal qualitative choices, you have the quantity threshold that's in place to prevent any sort of adverse reaction. Now, granted, you can break these rules if you stretch them far enough, but this is just the metrics I'm giving you, the measuring stick. So, short answer, keep the calories under control even if you're mixing carbs and fats. But there are some benefits to mixing them together. And when Emperor Shiv was describing that he felt, better satiety and the next day it was easier to get back into ketosis, here is why. Because when you mix fats with carbs, which is not necessarily the best thing to do all the time, you can, if you do it too much, you can create, fat storage, de novo lipogenesis. If you do it too much, you can create advanced glycation end products, which are basically glycated proteins, and they're not good for you. So the benefit here is that because you have the fats in place, you're actually going to stabilize your blood sugars more. Okay, if you think about the diets we're told to do all the time, it's high carb and keep the fats low. Okay, I mean, on one hand, you're going to have lower hormone production with that, but at the same time, you're going to be more addicted to sugar. So what mixing a decent bit of fat and a decent bit of carb does is that it actually slows the release of the blood sugar that you would have had, especially if the fat is a saturated fat. But in general, mixing fats and carbs is going to minimize the blood sugar spike. If you mix macros at one meal, you're going to minimize the insulin spike, you're going to minimize the blood sugar spike, and this will make it easier to get back into ketosis. However, that doesn't mean this is always the best thing to do. Of course, in carb backloading scenarios, you want to spike the insulin. You want the high glycemic carbs. If you want to build more muscle, those will help because the insulin spike. And when we're talking about sustainability and lifestyle, I'm going to explain the way I tend to do things for lifestyle, and then you'll understand the principle behind it. So typically for lifestyle days, lifestyle habits where I will have carbs, right? I do not restrict fat that much. Because what people will often tell you, oh, if you're having your carbs, keep your fats low. If you're having your fats, keep your carbs low. But if you think about it, if you are eating, 80% of your energy from fat and 20% from carb, this is not counting protein. Think about that. What's going to happen is you have less carb to run through before you re-enter ketosis. So as long as your quantity is under control, you are generally going to be fine. Think about it. It's actually less carb for your body to run through. And as long as your calorie threshold is not, pushed over, you will be, handling everything hormonally as best you can. So, and with regards to quality. So that's one key principle to take away. You don't necessarily have to get bent out of shape about the macro ratio you're eating on your carb days, because as long as calories are under control, you're under control. But when we're getting into understanding this deeper, okay, carbs are like a supplementary fuel, okay? Now granted, some people will tell you they're the primary fuel. That's not true. But they are a superseding fuel, because as soon as your body gets them, it will use them because they are a luxury in nature. The whole reason why they're the superseding fuel is because they're not the primary fuel our body wants. We do need, to make blood sugar all the time or else we'll die. But the point is your liver can do that, and it can make that from pure glucose all the time. But the point is your body can take a fat diet and throw in some carbs and use up those carbs. But if you're on a high carb diet and throw in some fat, your body's not going to use the fat first. So this is an interesting nuance of sort of ketogenic metabolism. So as far as lifestyle goes, if you are having keto as your baseline and throwing in carbs here and there, you don't really need to discriminate against the macro ratios that much unless you're very precise and have unique goals, in which case go to my consultations on my website, or my coaching if you're a long-term athlete sort of thing, or anything like that. Bottom line is, you don't necessarily need to get bent out of shape about the macro ratios, and having more fats and carbs on your carb days, although I'm not recommending you to slam this. I'm not recommending you to eat entire pizzas, okay, and push your calories over. But the point is, if you did eat an entire pizza and didn't have your calories pushed over if you were still in a deficit, you're not really going to run into any problems. Unless, like, we're talking super biohacker nerds who are, concerned about advanced glycation end products and, other inflammatory wheat proteins and things like that. I'm not getting it. This is not about longevity. This is partially a vanity goal and a lifestyle video, okay? And in general, most people's modern diets will combine larger amounts of those inflammatory compounds and make more of them than anything you're going to get from coming from keto and then using your carb days. So you're nowhere near that level if we're talking the big picture, concerns of longevity. Now, I know some people are going to be worried about cholesterol and lipid profiles from this. The shortest answer I can give you without getting into a full-blown consultation or something is, obviously when you mix large amounts of carb and fat, your lipid profile is going to, take a hit. Okay, you have to think about it too. Your triglycerides in your bloodstream, so fats moving through your bloodstream, are going to raise if you have a high amount of carb and fat, because your body's going to use the sugar first. Okay, so triglyceride gets swirled around longer, and that's one of the fundamental problems for people with problematic lipid profiles. But that's just a short, brief answer I can give you, just so you have some peace of mind as to understanding that you're probably not going to run into any problems with your lipid profile if you're regularly on a ketogenic metabolism and, using carbs responsibly. And, when you do have them, a great way to do it is to start off the day ketogenic and then throw in a little bit. Have them supplement the day. And if you don't want to start off the day ketogenic, you want to have carbs in the morning, then have the carbs in the morning. And then for the next meal, go into ketogenic meal as you normally would. But if you do desire another carb meal, have another one. Obviously you don't want to be in this perpetual cycle of always carb, right? High carb diets, and like in that way, are what the whole reason you got into keto, to prevent the problems of. But the implied premise here is that if you are on a ketogenic metabolism, you are already going to be fat adapted and you aren't going to have a severe craving to blood sugar and, foods that contain high amount of sugar. So in general, if you do want to start off the day with a carb meal, that's fine. Just go into the next meal, think, hey, do I want carbs again? If you do, have another one, because your craving amounts are going to be lower than the average bear. And if you want to just go back to keto eating, go for it. That's the way I treat it. Treat it on a moment-to-moment basis where it's like, hey, the next meal, go back to routine. Otherwise, I'll just have another carb meal, and after that, maybe I'll go back to routine. So let's bring this back to nature, okay? How would our ancestors acquire carbohydrates? A lot through scavenging. That's the only way we would have acquired it. So there either would have been fat in our diets at that point, or there wouldn't have been. So chances are the only way that, like, we weren't mass producing agriculture until a couple hundred years ago. So there would have been more availability as our civilizations progressed. But for the most part, if you were eating carbs, you were already in a ketogenic metabolism. And even if you were eating higher amounts, even if you did find, a bush of berries and ate a bunch of them, and that would have put your macros to 20 or 30% carb for the day, the thing is, first of all, they probably wouldn't have been over their caloric deficit. Otherwise, they would have been eating fat, right? Because that's a more calorically dense food. And the nature of scavenger foods is that they are, food that is scavenged. It is picked up as you move along, right? Or maybe you store a bunch of it too, but you can't really store them that long if you find, grains as well. So anyways, the point is, our body would have been used to having fat in place and then throwing in a bit of carbohydrate and using it. So let's get back into how your body stores fuel and the ratios of that. Let's call majority of your body's fuel source as fat, around 80%, and a minority of your fuels that are stored as carb, around 20%. This is not, exact amounts, and it's probably less than 20%, but the point is, majority of your stored fuel is fat, minority is carb. Chances are, your body wants to use fuel in that ratio, okay? So, this is, again, you can't make an ought from an is, okay? But the point is, most of our stored fuel is fat, and the small amount is carb. So, for the larger picture here and the applicability for you, if you are having still most of your lifestyle implementation days where you have carbs coming in as a minority and fat as a majority, it's not going to be a problem if your calories are controlled. Now, I would present this argument differently if I was speaking to somebody who was on a majority carb diet, because again, you cannot have added fats into a high carb diet to supersede the sugar. It's not going to work. So this is a different, perspective for people who are already in the keto dieting sphere, because you can throw in carbs and use them up. And if you're, still having a higher fat diet, it's not the fat that's necessarily going to, make it easier to get back into ketosis, because keto is not a high fat diet. It just means the absence of sugar. Okay, the fats can stabilize the blood sugars. The fats will be a primary fuel for you for sustenance, until you get some carb, and then they will use the carb. But the point is, your body is still in some way designed to have a mix of the two, but probably with the majority of the fuel still coming from fat. Okay, it would be very rare for our ancestors to have a diet that was very high carb and very low fat. It would be very rare for a 40-40-20 ratio to exist, because if you think about it, most of your protein sources, right, the golden ratio, 40-40-20, most of your protein sources would have been fatty. There was no chicken breast, there was just a whole chicken. There was no egg whites, there was just an egg. There was no, lean cut of beef, there was just the beef, and maybe you had a little bit more muscle meat one day. So the thing is, it's lean protein sources in the combination with high carb does not exist. 40-40-20 with 20% fat, not very likely to encounter in nature. And I'm not saying it's a problem, because again, you can control that via calories, because that's the one side of the coin that governs it. But the point is, do I think it's optimal? No. But is it possible to have optimal ratios where you have, who knows, maybe a 30-30, a 33-33-33 ratio? Maybe. But the point is that you just don't need to get as bent out of shape as everybody tells you, where it's like, oh, if you have your high fat days, you gotta lower the carbs, or if you have your high carb days, you gotta lower the fats. No, this is not an integrated way to look at the problem. And when we're talking about how to understand all this fitness stuff, the key to it is to understand the quality and the quantity. This is stuff that nobody else talks about, maybe Gary Taubes, actually, but either way, nobody really talks about this stuff, especially in the fitness, sphere. So when we're getting into ways for you to wrap your head around all this, it'll make far more sense as you continue to understand the quality and quantity. But how it applies to you, to answer Emperor Sheev's question at the end there, is, do you think keeping the high fats is going to keep me in ketosis, right? Even if I'm eating some medium glycemic carbs. It's not necessarily the fats. It is a better practical way to conduct your day in a manner where you're starting it off ketogenically and then eating the carbs as you desire. That is how our ancestors would have done this. They would have got their carbs through scavenging. Okay, mass agriculture has only been around for the past couple hundred years. Granted, our ancestors would have progressed throughout the years, as civilization grew. But the point is, majority of our fuel would have been probably from the ketogenic state. And, doesn't mean other societies didn't have higher carb diets, but it simply means that the availability for carbohydrates to be a high carb diet was simply not there. But even if you do a high carb diet, get some fats in there as long as your calories are controlled. And as far as the fitness lifestyle benefits go, you will achieve them. You don't need to worry about, mixing too much. And having days where you have, very high carb and low fat, that's not necessarily the best thing to do. and vice versa. But there are times and place for those, techniques, but perhaps I'll get into those in another video because this one's already going on a little bit longer than I want it to. So, like this video, subscribe, and follow my Instagram. And, leave me some comments. I'll do my best to answer them down below. And if you do leave a comment, perhaps I'll bring it up in a video like this, because I think that's a good way to kind of get to the burning problems that people have. So thank you for the question, Emperor Sheev, and all the support as well. And that goes for you watching as well if you're not Emperor Sheev. Peace.